Hello, and welcome to Why Natives, presented by the Jackson County Library and the Jackson County Master Gardeners. My name is Spencer, and I'm an adult services librarian here at the Jackson County Library in Medford. I want to remind everybody to keep your microphones muted to avoid distractions for our presenter. We'll be using the chat function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. Feel free to type as they come up, and I will focus on those if there's any kind of logistical things like sound issues, that sort of thing throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we will address questions related to the presentation at the end so Lynn can have a chance to respond to them. Before I go ahead and turn it over to her, I just want to share our land acknowledgement, which is that Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lakawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. And then lastly, I just want to say that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of JCLS. With that, I'm ready to turn it over to Lynn if you want to get started.
All right. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Everybody's good? All right, great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about native plants and why those are important to us. Just a little bit about me. I am a retired middle school science teacher and special ed teacher and a bunch of other subjects, but science primarily. And hold a degree in wildlife management from Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly, Humboldt State, and a master's in science education from SOU. So anyway, this presentation is about saving nature 1 yard at a time. It's what all of us can do to help the planet. And let's get started. So the presentation is based on the book by Doug Tallamy, which is called Nature's Best Hope. If you don't know who Dr. Tallamy is, he is an entomologist, professor of entomology and ecology at the University of Delaware. And if you want to know more about him and you're interested in getting a copy of this slide presentation, you can either email me and ask me to send you a slide presentation, or you can write down these words and go to YouTube and look up Dr. Tallamy giving this presentation. He's much more dynamic speaker than I am. He's much more well-versed in all the, I mean, I just stole everything from him. So with his blessing, and in fact, your homework assignment is to, at some point, go to YouTube, look up Doug Tallamy or this presentation and watch him online. He is a consummate educator, wonderful man. And there he is with me. I met him in November, and there I am grinning like a 13-year-old Taylor Swift fangirl, because I couldn't even speak when I met him. I was so overwhelmed. So because he really did change everything about the way I garden and how I look at the world. So the problem, which I kind of need to define for you, why should we care? There is currently worldwide an insect apocalypse occurring. And countries around the world are reporting massive insect declines. And insects, of course, just above plants, are the base of the food web. They are the krill of the land. When you think about whales eating krill in the ocean, you need to think about every other animal that's on land eating insects or depending on insects for their livelihoods, either directly or indirectly. We have a loss of native habitat. Well, that's pretty obvious. We're paving the world, right? So animals of all kinds are losing their habitat. A loss of 3 billion North American birds in the last 30 years. It's more than that now because this number comes from probably, I don't know, 10 years ago. So it's kind of old information now. Loss of other wildlife. Obviously, we've got a lot of animals in danger all over the planet. And the drivers of these losses that we're witnessing are industrial agriculture, where we're farming huge swaths of lands with big machinery, and there are no refuges anywhere along those. They till road to road now. So there used to be kind of ditches and creek beds and roadsides where nature could maybe keep a toehold. Not any longer, not with the way we are growing our crops. Roads, of course, are a huge hazard, and you've probably all heard about the big wildlife crossings that are now being installed around the country, the biggest one recently in LA, to help animals move safely from across roadways to around patchy environments. Unnecessary lights. We know that lights at night interfere with bird and insect migrations, animal migrations, animal breeding. So we've destroyed the nighttime environment. Tens of millions of acres of sterile lawn, which people don't often think of, and widespread destruction and displacement of native plants. So we're going to talk about all of those things today. But just to give you a look at what we're kind of seeing, when I was a child and I went on a road trip with my parents, we had to stop every half hour to hour and clean the windshield because it looked like this. This is my car. This is my 2018 Forester, Subaru Forester. And this is my car after I had driven to Corvallis and back for a presentation in 2023. There were 7 or 8 insect impacts. That should be terrifying to everybody. This is not a pretty thing when you don't have to stop and clean your windshield. It means we really are losing our insect populations. And this is called a shifting baseline. What that means is that we have 3 generations now who 2 or 3 generations that don't remember this. They only know this. They think this is normal. This is far from normal. And so the baseline shifts. Each generation thinks, I don't need to, I'm not missing passenger pigeons because they weren't around when I was a kid. We don't miss buffalo because they weren't around when we were kids. Our kids don't miss insects because they're not around. All right, so we can't survive without the insects. They support our food webs. They provide pollination services. These are honeybees, which are a non-native bee to North America. These are some of our native bees. Just a few of them. We have like 1,400 species of them. So we can turn it around. As we go through the slides, you'll see I'll be showing you some plants like this Agastaki. It's horse mint or butterfly mint, if you like, a common name, Agastaki urticifolia. And there'll be some information in pink on the slide, and it will tell you how many insects this plant supports, or insects that can lay their eggs on this plant. Now, this is low for this plant. It hosts many more insects than this, but that's one of the ones that it hosts. Anyway, that's just to tell you what to look for and what those pink numbers mean. So the good news is we can reverse the insect decline and save nature and our birds. And I'm very big into saving our birds because they are the living descendants of dinosaurs, and we want to keep them going. So by making our yards and public spaces look like this, kind of this natural looking environment instead of this. If you have a yard that looks like this, and most of our suburbs do look like this, this is a sterile yard. These are non-native Asian or European shrubs. This is non-native turf grass, and none of these support wildlife. If you don't go out in your yard and hear buzzing and chirping and whirring and insect noises, then you have a sterile yard, and you need to think twice about that. So if we plant things like this, you can focus on the land that's easiest for you to control, and that is your yard. This is a red flowering currant, Ribes sanguineum. This is one of our native plants, and it hosts, meaning butterflies and moths, 81 species of them can lay their eggs on this plant. Okay, so you can focus on your own property. And this is how we're going to save the planet. Because most property in the US is privately owned, and we need to start thinking about what it is we're putting on those properties so that we can help nature in any way we can. So all native insects in North America specialize on eating native plants. This is true in any country you go to. The native insect population there has evolved with the native plant population there. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they make very nasty chemicals. Those chemicals deter most insects from eating them, but certain suites of insects work around the chemicals that certain types of plants make, and therefore they have a relationship, a very specialized relationship, and the insects depend on the plants depend on those insects. So here is one of those relationships. 90% of insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. This is the California pipevine swallowtail butterfly, this beautiful blue butterfly, and she can only lay her eggs on this pipevine, this California pipevine, Aristolochia californica. If you don't have this pipevine in your yard, you will never see this butterfly because she won't come. She can't. It's not worth it for her to come through your yard. She might fly by if your neighbor has a pipevine and visit your flowers, but she has to lay her eggs on this plant, just like a monarch butterfly has to lay her eggs on milkweed. All right. Native plants have adapted to their hungry caterpillars. And there are 7 steps that you can take to make a difference and help save nature in your yard. Step 1, remove at least half your lawn. And people get really crazed when they hear this. Well, we need the lawn. We need the lawn. We have to look like the rest of the neighborhood, and we have to have a place for our kids. I get that. You know, you want a place for the kids to play. We're asking you to take out half. If you don't use your front lawn, then maybe you could remove that. Leave the back lawn for the kids to play on, or vice versa, however you want to do it. But lawns do not support native insects. They don't build or protect the soil. They waste and pollute water. We know about water running off on lawns all summer long as people overwater their lawns. They overwater and they overfertilize. Really, the worst chemical pollution of our streams doesn't come from agriculture. It comes from homeowners over fertilizing their yards. Those fertilizers leach through or run off in the water, which goes directly into our stream systems and causes pollution in the streams. They pollute the air because, of course, we're using gas mowers and leaf blowers. So there's noise that's scaring wildlife and disrupting, reproduction in our birds, in our neighborhoods. Lawn mowers and leaf blowers, because they have 2-cycle engines, are far more polluting than cars. So the statistics are really horrible on this. And the statistics on people who make a living mowing and blowing indicate that rates of cancer in those populations of those people who are doing your lawn services are much higher than the average member of the public. So here we go. Staggering wastefulness of the American lawn. We have 45 million acres, in lawn, and we're adding more every year. So this is, again, is kind of a dated statistic. We use 2 billion gallons of gas for lawn equipment, which we could be putting in our vehicles, because it's a precious resource. 41 pounds of CO2 are emitted from those leaf blowers and mowers, 13 billion pounds of carcinogenic air pollutants emitted from the blowers and mowers, 100 million pounds of lawn chemicals. And again, I have to say, this is mostly applied by people going into the big box stores and bringing those things home and weeding and feeding their lawns, right? And 9 billion gallons of water every day. Every day. And if you live, on a farm, it's probably your well water that you're pumping out there on your lawn. If you live in the suburbs like I do, it's potable water. We've treated that water. And now we're putting it out on our yards. So really, really wasteful. And then we do that all every year. So something to keep in mind. Now you could do something like this. If you need a mowed area on your property, sure, you might want to mow a path through a meadow that you allow to go. Think of all the pollinators that would be serviced by something like this, whereas this is not providing any kind of vegetative food or pollen and nectar for pollinators. Or something like this, which is more formal. There's still lawn here. You don't have to give up all the lawn. We're asking for half. And the reason we ask for half, there's a method to that madness. We have in the United States 20 million square miles of national park. It's not miles, it's acres. 20 million acres of national park. If we took out half of the 45 million acres of lawn that we had, we would have doubled and put in native plants, we'd have doubled our acreage for native plants. So here's an example of what turf grass is doing in your yard. This is turf grass. It has a very short, that's probably a very shortened, it might have roots that go down even a foot if you're lucky, usually 8 inches or so. But if you look at native plants, they are putting roots down feet, sometimes 15 feet, sometimes past that. So native grasses and native plants, herbaceous plants, are helping to hold and build soil. So their roots act like sponges. They control flooding. Here's another impression of these amazing grass roots from our native bunch grasses. So if we took out half the lawns in the nation, we could add and then planted those lawn areas with native plants. We could add more native acreage than Everglades, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Mount Rainier, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, North Cascades, Badlands, Olympic Sequoia, Denali, and Great Smoky Mountains National Parks combined. So this is one of Dr. Tallamy's ideas. Remove half the lawns, replant with natives, and we've doubled the size of our national parks. You can have a national park right in your yard. You don't have to drive horrible distances. You can see breeding birds and life come back to your neighborhood, and you don't have to drive. You don't have to fight the crowds. There are lots of benefits to having wildlife in your yard, right? Nature in your yard. Step 2, remove as much as possible the non-native and invasive plants. So this is part of the restructuring of your garden. This is fennel, which I always, as a gardener, used to grow. It is wildly invasive and is on the invasive species list in Oregon because it makes seed. The birds eat the seed and then they fly away from your house and they deposit it in creek beds where it flourishes and then outcompetes native plants. Very, very invasive plant. And as much as we love fennel, if you're going to grow it in your yard, which you shouldn't do, make sure you cover the seed heads before they have reached maturity so that you're gathering the seed and not letting that get out into the environment. Everybody knows what this is. This is butterfly bush, which has now been made illegal in Oregon. You can't buy it at the nurseries. They say that they have a sterile variety that they will sell to you. Always be suspicious of sterile varieties. Bradford pear, which we also call calorie pear, that ornamental pear that's planted everywhere, all over the country, was supposed to be a sterile horticultural variety. It didn't produce seed. Well, no, nature finds a way, and it does produce seed, and it gets out, and now calorie pear is the most invasive species on the eastern seaboard. So it's just ruining ecosystems everywhere it turns up. This Buddleia here is in the Kalmiopsis wilderness. Nobody went out there and planted it. The birds took it out there. So if you have these invasives in your yard, they are going to spread into the natural environment because that's what birds do. They eat and they fly and they poop. All right, so invasive species, English ivy also has been outlawed now in Oregon, but here it is choking the Portland forest, right? This is as you drive past the forest in Portland on the freeway, this is what you're seeing. And those vines will continue to grow and choke and kill those trees. This is Scotch broom, and this is English laurel, also in the Portland forest with the ivy, right? I mean, so if a plant has something, if you go to the nursery and a plant, here's a tip. You go to the nursery and it says something like Scotch broom, Japanese spurge, Chinese something. If it's got a name that comes from another country, maybe not buy it. Okay, look for a native alternative. So step 3 is your alternative. Plant native plants. Find and plant native plants. We have a nursery that grows native plants out at Jackson Extension. The master gardeners run that. The master gardener volunteers run that nursery. And you can come to our sales and you can buy native plants from us, or you can get them from other nurseries in the area. We have a couple different nurseries in the area that sell native plants. So here is Philadelphus lewisii. It's called mock orange, but if you go to the nursery and ask for mock orange, never do that. They're going to give you the one that comes from China because the common name is meaningless. What you want to do is go and ask for the scientific name of the plant that you want and ask them for that. So it's a beautiful shrub. It does have a lovely orange fragrance, like orange blossoms when it's blooming in the spring. It's gorgeous and it will fit into your yard. You can do it. So the way we've landscaped in the past, and I am as guilty of this as anybody. I went out to the nursery, I'd see something I loved, I'd go, oh, I've got to have that, take it home and stuff it in my yard somewhere. But I was only looking at the decorative value of that plant. I was not thinking about its functional value in the ecosystem. And we really have to change our criteria for selecting plants now that we're going to be putting into our local landscapes. And so what we need to think about are the values, the other values that native plants bring. Decorative plants give us these, but native plants will help carbon sequestration, in other words, pumping carbon into the soil and keeping it there, out of the air, CO2 out of the air, putting it into the soil where it will stay for up to 1,000 years. Wildlife appreciation, because if you do this enough in your yard, you're going to start having birds breeding in your yard, not just visiting your yard, breeding, nesting, raising young in your yard. Soil restoration, weather moderation. They're going to help keep you cooler in the summer. Watershed value. They're going to help the water percolate better into your site. They're going to provide pollinator habitat. So for native bees, native butterflies, and of course, food web value, because you'll be growing a lot of little insects that birds will come and feed on. All right, native plants build and hold our soil. So soil restoration and carbon sequestration, incredibly important. Here's an agricultural crop, probably barley or wheat maybe. Look at the no root system there to hold that soil. Look at the native bunch grasses, holding the soil and putting carbon down into that far down into the soil. All right, they provide food for native insects, and 90% of our native insects have to feed on native plants. Here's our beautiful blue camas lily. These grow all over our valley. And our native caterpillars have to eat native plants. This is red twig dogwood. It supports, or there are 54 species of moth and butterfly that will lay their eggs on this plant. But you won't notice that when you go by. It will not look like the thing is being eaten to death. And in fact, when I see insect damage on a plant, I'm thrilled because it means somebody's getting a meal. So caterpillars, why do I keep harping about caterpillars? Well, they're essential for most bird group reproduction. So here are our titmice and our chickadees and our bush tits. This is a titmouse chickadee. These are bush tits. They're darling little birds that come in flocks. But for the most part, they forage off of branches and the leaves of trees and shrubs. So they're found in mixed flocks, many other species of birds. They're called gleaning gilts. So you'll see a bunch of birds coming through and they're hopping around in the shrubbery and they're getting the insects off those bushes. They feed mostly on insects, not on seed. People love to put seed bird feeders up. All you're doing is helping finches and doves. So gleaning insects for food. These little perching birds have to have insect food. My slides are not advancing. There you go. So let's talk about a chickadee just for a minute. It weighs 0.35 ounces. That's the size of, you hold your hand out and think about 4 pennies in your hand. That's what that little bird weighs. And for that little bird to reproduce, he and his mate have to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to feed their baby birds. And why caterpillars, right? If we want chickadees, we have to grow the trees and shrubs that grow the caterpillars. It's the plants that are growing the caterpillars, right? And why do we want caterpillars? So here comes the crux of the matter. And it could be because they're beautiful, and they are. They're really cool looking caterpillars out there. Some are actually very scary looking. Or because they have really cool names. Like Batis philanor, which is the pipevine swallowtail, and this guy, this Cecropia moth, he's one of the better looking ones. Painted ladies, they got cool names. But really, the reason we want caterpillars in our yards are because they are soft, large, high in protein, high in fats, and the best source of carotenoids, which are what make for strong eyes and beautiful feather color in our birds. And they're easy to stuff down a baby bird throat. So look at this thing. It's like a giant green bratwurst. And that's what parents do. They plunge those things down their babies' throats. If they had to put like a big scratchy beetle, which is more like a tank because it's got a huge exoskeleton, that could be harmful to baby birds. But these big, soft, squishy guys that are up eating the leaves of trees and shrubs, those are perfect baby bird food. And it's what the baby birds have to have, right? So you can't have chickadees if you don't have caterpillars. And you can't have the caterpillars if you don't have the plants. We want more than chickadees. Most birds are bigger than chickadees, so they need even more caterpillars. We're talking millions of caterpillars that are needed to maintain our bird populations. We want warblers and all these other birds. They glean insects from the leaves of trees and shrubs. So you get to see that, and here's coffeeberry, 21 species of moth and butterfly put their little eggs and caterpillars right in this plant so that they're available for the birds to eat. Thrushes are pretty large birds. Think of robins and bluebirds and hermit thrushes. They're down in the leaf litter and gleaning insects off the ground from the leaf litter that's dropped under the trees and shrubs where those caterpillars have been laid. And you can see some of the insect damage in these trees here where caterpillars have been eating. Important. Woodpeckers, quite large. We want all of these guys too. They have to feed insects to their young. They can't feed them seeds. Wrens also foraging in dense vegetation from the ground way up into the tops of the trees. These little tiny birds taking insects back to the nest to feed their young. Jays, our crows, our ravens, our magpies, all need insect food to rear their young. Vireos also. So vireos forage from the ground to the treetops. We need to think about vertical space as well as horizontal plantings. Most people think about, I'm going to put in a garden for the butterflies, and they're just putting something in that adult butterflies can use. No, you need to think of what vegetation do those butterflies need to lay their eggs on so that I can have the caterpillars that will make more butterflies. Think vertically as well as horizontally. Here are flycatchers, which are birds that perch on wires or branches and then fly out over meadows and catch flying insects, just like that. So host plant choice matters. It matters what we choose to put in our yards. And here are some examples. So if you have a place, a large enough property where you can plant a willow is probably the most powerful plant you could plant in your yard because it hosts. In other words, there are 312 species of moth and butterfly that can lay their eggs for their caterpillars to eat on willow. This is serviceberry, which is much more amenable to a small yard. It not only does it produce berries, which the birds and you can eat, but it hosts 81 species of moth and butterfly. So lots of insect life in here for parent birds to come and get and take back to their nests. So we add caterpillars to our landscapes by adding the native plants that make them. And by the way, each of these plants is from a different family of plants. And so they have their own unique suite of insects that are adapted to those families of plants. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So keystone plant, this is an oak tree, and an oak tree is a keystone plant in Oregon, second only to willow. Oaks host about 250 species of moth and butterfly. So this is a white oak. And when we talk about a keystone, you think about the old Roman arch where you had all these blocks put in place, but it's this stone here, the keystone block, that if you remove it, the rest of this system collapses, right? If we start removing our keystone plants from our environments, like our oaks and our willows and our wild cherries, we are going to look at ecosystem collapse. So we need to make sure we're planting the keystones. So willow was one, oak was one. This is another, black cherry, prunus. We have 3 cherries in Western or in Oregon that are native. This is a choke cherry. We also have bitter cherry and Klamath plum, which actually is like a small plum. that you can make jams and jellies from. You can get these and make jellies and jams from them. They're not quite as they're not as large. They all got bigger seeds than the cultivars that we grow in our vegetable gardens and our orchards. But you notice that they will host 240 species of moth and butterfly, different from the willows and the oaks. So if you have those 3 trees in your yard, you are providing a lot of food for a lot of birds. So here, Bradford pear is a non-native pear. It's that one that I talked about getting loose, and people plant them as decorative. They just think they're so pretty, and they don't make messy fruit. No, because it's small, and the birds just take those away and dump them and poop them out in other places. So 11 caterpillars on one tree in a study that Dr. Tallamy did. One species of inchworm on these trees. That's not a food source. That is not a food source for any kind of bird that's trying to raise young. So, but if we plant a hawthorn, we'll have many more. You can, instead of planting a Bradford pear or some ornamental pear from Asia, plant our native hawthorn, and you'll have lots of native insects in there that the birds can then come and utilize. This is burning bush, also an invasive species in Oregon from China. It supports one type of insect. Only one type of moth can lay its eggs in this. And so it's not providing any kind of ecological service in our yards. Yeah, it's eye candy, but it's not doing anything else. If we add caterpillars to our suburban ecosystems by planting native vegetation, we'll be breeding birds. And that's the word right there, breeding. We want to be breeding birds, right? To keep their populations high. You don't have to rip out all your non-native plants, but we want to aim for 70% native vegetation. That seems high. But if you think about shrubs and trees, and you're thinking about the green biomass in your yard, trees and shrubs are a big part of that. And you can kind of estimate, oh man, if I put in a big tree, that could be up to 50% of the vegetation in my yard, right? So it's not that hard to attain a 70% native vegetative state in your yard. In the green biomass, one large tree plus some shrubs can be up to 50% of your vegetation. So making insects in your yard supports life. Here's our deerbrush, our wild California lilac, 93 species of insect hosted on that plant. And there are some of them, really beautiful little butterflies that will lay their eggs in that plant. And then you will have these in your yard, as well as other things. Okay, so if you start looking at the keystone native plants and you start adding them, it is additive in terms of the number of species. Lepidoptera just means moth and butterfly. That's the family, or that's an order of moths and butterflies that are hosted by that plant. So that's willow. But then if you add a cherry, you've added another couple hundred species. So now you're adding these up as you go. You're getting 550 different species of moth and butterfly in your yard. Here, when you add a poplar and an alder and an oak and a pine and a birch, if you have a big property, I would recommend putting all of these if you have the space and the conditions where these will thrive. Anyway, you get the idea. If you add all these, suddenly you have 1,900 different species of caterpillar in your to attract any number of different bird species to come and feast and raise their young. If one of these species of caterpillar or moth fails and they have a bad year because of temperature conditions or something's not ideal for them, you still have, another 1,900 that are going to be there. So this is kind of insurance for you to keep things alive and healthy in your yard. So as many diverse plants as you can, and really choosing keystone species is important. And Xerces Society has a great pamphlet about those species. You can go to the Xerces site online, and I have some links to those at the end of the program. When you buy a plant at the nursery, you are buying a bird feeder, and you get to decide whether that feeder will be full or not. So if you plant a willow, hooray, your bird feeder is full, right? Because you're growing all these species of caterpillar. If you buy a ginkgo, and they're lovely, we love ginkgos, but really they are non-contributors to the ecosystem. They only host 4 species of caterpillar, and oops, your bird feeder is empty. So choose the one that's going to give you more bang for your buck, right? Native prunus supports 240 species of caterpillar. Nandina, no caterpillars. And this is in every yard in my neighborhood. And the problem is that those berries in those clusters, when there's little food from other natural native plants, cedar waxwings will come in large flocks and strip these. These berries have cyanide in them. A robin will eat 10 of them and fly off and be fine, be able to deal with that cyanide. But cedar waxwings eat until they can't move anymore. They gorge. And when they get that much cyanide in their bodies, it can kill them. And so autopsied cedar waxwings that have been feeding exclusively on Nandina show lesions on their internal organs from cyanide poisoning. So don't plant that. Plant native viburnum instead. Here's a viburnum, and it has to be Viburnum ellipticum here in Oregon. You don't want to get the one that comes from Asia, but lovely berries for the birds to come in the fall to get beautiful fall color and this lovely spring bloom. Always choose a native when you can. Here's an evergreen native. It's our state flower, Oregon grape. Really a nice plant. If you want to look up keystone species, you can go to this site, Native Plant Finder, and this is in the footnotes at the end of the presentation also. And you can look up what the keystone species are based on your you put in your zip code, and it will give you a list of the flowers, the shrubs, and the trees that are keystone in your area. So step 4 is to avoid the use of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. So we want you to use integrated pest management practices. And if you can give your yard some time to just grow the beneficial insects that you need, you will be able to do away with all of these external inputs that come to us from the chemical industry. So if you plant natives, of course, they're used to dealing with the insects that are on them, and you don't need to spray them. We're especially worried about neonicotinoids. These are the systemic insecticides that some growers use on their plants before they go out to the nurseries. So growers that are producing mass amounts of plants will drench their plants with these chemicals. And neonicotinoid you will never see on the label of the plant itself, but you might see any of these words. These are neonicotinoids. They get into the system of the plant, even up into the pollen and nectar, and they kill insects. So we drench the plant, and the plant uptakes, or if we're spraying out in the environment, the plant uptakes 20% of the insecticide, and the beetle that eats it dies, right? And we're targeting the insects that are eating it. But it's also, when we spray, we are leaching most of that into the environment. So it's killing things in the soil. It's affecting the seeds of the plants. Birds that are coming later to eat the seeds of these plants that have been treated are picking up this insecticide. The soil gets 80 to 98% of it. It leaches into our aquatic streams. Our aquatic streams, our aquatic environments for insects are very, very, very compromised. In some streams around the US, 96% of the invertebrates in the stream have disappeared. Those are fish food. And so our fish are not able to access the food that they need. So this whole cycle of poisoning that we've been sort of locked into is really frightening and problematic. And so with native plants, we'll need less of that. So they've evolved to deal with their insects, and you don't need fertilizers for them. You don't need pesticides for them. You save money, and you actually have less maintenance to do because they're adapted to your site. They need less water because natives that are native here to the Rogue Valley have adapted to dry summers, dry, hot summers. So choose native plants for your yard. You're going to focus on these two groups of insects: the caterpillars, which we just finished talking about, and pollinators, bees, adult butterflies, and moths. So step 5 of your program is to build a pollinator garden. And here's another native plant, Pearly Everlasting. We're going to skip this for now because that's a cool video, but I don't think we have time for me to show you that. So our major pollinators here are native bees and butterflies. This is a little native wasp, 1 species of honeybee, and 4,000 species of native bees, 14,000 species of moths and butterflies. And bees are critical for pollination needs, so we want to plan for them. Native and honeybees use pollen from goldenrods to provision their nests. Goldenrod is here's a bunch of little native bees on goldenrod. And here's a sweat bee. Here's an emerald sweat bee. So we're talking about native bees, and they collect pollen and nectar. They nest in pithy stems and woody stems. And then there are some that cut leaves and make these cool chambers for their eggs. Here is a resin bee. She makes like a waxy barrier between her larvae. She makes a pollen ball with nectar, and then she lays a little larva. And these are mason bees. They actually make mud nests. So a lot of these cute little bees that are making their homes, and then some of them nest in the ground. People like to put up these wonderful insectaries. They need to be maintained. You can't just leave them and walk away. They concentrate parasites like these mites on this little blue orchard bee, and they have to be cleaned regularly. They concentrate disease. Native plants will spread your bees around. You just leave the stems up in your yard, and I know it looks messy and your neighbors are probably going to have a fit, but it spreads the bees out in the landscape, and they're not prone to this kind of attack from parasites, predators, right? Step 6 is to leave the leaves, and you probably have heard this before, but we want you to take the leaves off your lawn and rake them in under the shrubbery in your yard. Don't put them in a bag. 70 species of moth and caterpillar eat dead leaves and fungi and lichen. They need that for food. They need it for food over the winter. Leaves are not litter. They are habitat. So you want to leave those. All of these species of butterfly and moth overwinter in leaves or soil. So you want to leave those. Thousands of species of native flies, which are our second most important pollinators after bees. This is a soldier fly. It's a beautiful, people think it's a wasp. It is not, but it makes these fantastic sausage larvae that the winter birds can find under the leaves in your yard. Don't don't rake the leaves away and put them in a bag and send them to the landfill, right? Don't, and they are incredibly nutritious, these larvae, and they're everywhere under the leaf litter. This is the little long-legged fly. He eats fungus gnats and aphids and thrips. If you leave the leaves for this guy, he'll be in your garden in the summer and he'll eat all those things that are eating your cabbages and your tomatoes, right? So don't throw the leaves away. Hoverflies, same thing, really important. They are they're bee mimics. That's a fly, it's not a bee. And that's its larva eating an aphid. So they go around and patrol your plants and eat the bad guys that are eating your vegetables. All right, leave the seed heads. This is a finch eating seed heads out of some kind of aster. Leave the stems. That's a gall, and that little woodpecker knows there's a larva in there that it can eat during the winter, right? Leave the seed heads, leave the stems, leave the leaves, build a brush pile. If you can leave a brush pile somewhere in your yard, or a log that's been turned over and pushed up against the vegetation, provides incredible habitat for a number of different animals. All right. Plan for water and cover and nesting sites and food. You want to make sure all of these things are available in your yard to provide what animals need. They need the same things we do. They need food and shelter and water, right? And the last thing, step 7, is to turn out your lights at night. You could put in motion sensor lights on your driveway. Leaving these on at night confuses and it just exhausts our nighttime pollinators. And we have more moths than we have butterflies in the US. And the moths are doing incredible pollination services at night, but they are confused by lights, and then they don't breed because they're banging their little heads into the lights. Okay. Use motion sensor lights in your yard. You know, people have these floodlights in my neighborhood, and it's not like the bad man is coming every night through the neighborhood. And if the bad man comes at night and a light goes on when he passes the driveway or he comes up the driveway, he's probably going to turn around and leave. So motion sensor lights work just fine, and they're only on for 15 seconds. So if you can't do that, if you absolutely have to have, you know, some light pouring out into your neighborhood, use yellow LED lights. The white and blue spectrum lights are the ones that the pollinators are going to go to. So use yellow lights, and then it will at least be somewhat safer for our migrating birds and all of our nighttime pollinators. Okay. So we can only save nature if we learn to live with it. We have to be willing to live with some critters in our yards, but you, each of you, can help save the world. So there you go.